Citrix released Xendesktop 7 to the general public on or about June of 2013. That release was accompanied with a large amount of fanfare. A lot of people very excited to see this new release, whole number revision to this great technology. But it was also released with no small amount of confusion as well. Many people who were familiar with the Xenapp solution, formerly Presentation Server, formerly Metaframe, were used to Citrix's Independent Management Architecture, or IMA, as the solution, almost the broker really, that coordinated all the components together and connected up users with their desktops and applications. In recent years, Citrix also released their Xendesktop solution. Xendesktop was more closely aligned with the VDI use case, connecting users up with the desktop operating system. Now, Xendesktop, in the previous versions, and now currently Xendesktop 7, relies on a different management architecture called the FMA, or FlexCast Management Architecture. What's important to recognize here is that when we are talking about Xendesktop 7, so if I can grab my little pen here, anytime we're talking about Xendesktop 7 and really the FMA architecture, what we're really talking about is the amalgamation of classic Xenapp with classic Xendesktop. The Xenapp relied on the IMA, and Xendesktop relied on the FMA. And essentially, we have taken the traditional IMA approach and eliminated it in favor of this new FlexCast approach. This is important to recognize because the fact that these two products are now really one product is something that's not entirely well spelled out when you look through the Citrix literature. What Citrix is trying to focus you in on, as opposed to which products are now combined with which products, is instead which use cases, which approaches that you can use in connecting up users with applications. In this nugget here in just a minute, I want to focus in on kind of a chart that I've put together that may help you better understand the possible use cases that now exist thanks to the new FMA architecture, this new FlexCast solution that Citrix is now providing. Xendesktop has really kind of four primary use cases. Again, we'll talk about those in a second. There is a fifth use case called remote PC access, which literally provides nothing more than connecting up your users to their existing PCs. And I shouldn't say nothing more. That's actually a pretty awesome capability that they've added here into Xendesktop. But you can, with Xendesktop, connect up users using the ICA protocol so that they can access whatever their home PCs are. We've got a whole nugget on that one coming up. And it's really, at least for our purposes here, the least interesting of all the possible use cases that exist. So I'll kind of punt on that topic for just a little bit. After we talk about the use cases, and after you become more familiarized with what is possible to be done with Xendesktop, I want to show you all the possible components that you can lay into place. And in fact, all the components that we will be laying into place here in this series. The delivery controller being sort of the central command center of everything that involves Xendesktop 7. Our storefront server, which is the user's front door, that location which connects them up directly into the resources that you've exposed for them. Provisioning services as one of the solutions for actually getting new assets brought online. NetScaler as the firewall, for lack of a better term, but there's so much more to NetScaler than just calling it a firewall. The NetScaler tool that allows users to connect from untrusted environments into this environment in a fully trusted way. And then some of the other more management-centric solutions like Studio, which is for you and other Citrix admins, Director for your help desk, and then the license server that everything uses in order to make sure you're always up to date with your license count. I'm going to show you here in just a minute a nice kind of drawing that will help you understand where all these pieces connect and especially kind of help guide us as we go through some of the initial phases in this series. Before we do that, however, let's actually kind of focus then again on the possible use cases that Citrix is really designed or Xendesktop is designed to fulfill. And I don't want to focus necessarily on technologies here. I want to focus instead on how you get the user connected up to the application that they require. So let's go backwards in time for just a moment. If we go all the way back to the very beginning of remote applications, maybe not to the mainframe days, but at least the Windows remote application days, the earliest of these days were some of the beginnings of terminal services. There were technologies like WinFrame and the earliest of Metaframe out there also that existed with terminal services. But terminal services was at its core a tool that allowed you to remotely access a Windows server box and work with the applications that were installed on that box. So in the earliest of the terminal services days, well, these were applications that were hosted on Windows Server, but the user was actually, they were provisioned to the user. The user actually accessed them through a full desktop. Right? When the user needed to connect up to things in the terminal services days, they had the full start menu, they had the desktop icons, they had all the other stuff that one would associate with a remote desktop. Well, that was sort of the beginning of remote applications. And in fact, remote desktop services actually augmented this. If it still exists today, you can, with the remote desktop services, connect up to a server and provision out a desktop so that people can use it. In fact, even today with Xendesktop 7, Xendesktop 7 and the former Xenapp were really focused in on applications that were hosted on servers, and in one option were delivered as desktops. Now fast forward just a little bit in time. If you recall, when Citrix began sort of really releasing the MetaFrame product, back in the earliest of days again, one of the big value props of the MetaFrame product was the fact with MetaFrame, I could host my application on a server, but I could deliver it not as a full desktop, but as an application. In fact, Citrix had Citrix published applications as one of their big main reasons why you would move to Citrix. I don't want to have to lock down that desktop. I don't want to have to make sure that users can't deny each other access or do something that would screw up that server. In fact, I just want to publish the application because the application is really all that the user is interested in. Citrix provided this as really one of the biggest features of the MetaFrame product for a lot of years, and eventually Microsoft caught up with remote desktop services through the RDS, what were called remote apps. And in fact, today, you can still deploy RDS remote apps with Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. But the most important thing to recognize is that all of these use cases involve applications that were hosted on servers. Fast forward even just a little bit further, and the IT industry began its ever-increasing embrace of virtualization. With that increasing embrace of virtualization, we started out in the server world, and eventually some smart people realized that we could use the virtualization tools to also virtualize desktops. Well, with these virtualized desktops, some of the early entrees into desktop virtualization were applications that were installed on a virtualized desktop, but were then delivered also as a desktop. We think of this as predominantly VDI. In a VDI infrastructure, typically what I'm doing is moving a user's, so the location where they're doing their computing, from the actual desktop that sits next to them, the device that is proximate to them in the world, and we move it back into the data center. I install applications on those desktops, and then I make the desktops available to users as a desktop. Same start button, same desktop icon, same background, all the same features that were most closely aligned with the earliest days of terminal services. But now that we think of them not as being on a server, but instead as on a desktop. Now this right series, this right column here, it corresponds with what we think of, at least here in the Citrix world, as Xendesktop, the traditional Xendesktop. So when Xendesktop arrived, Xendesktop was designed specifically to focus in on applications hosted on the desktop and then delivered on that desktop as well. Now fast forward pretty close to where we are today, and we have all of these possible use cases, including now the ability to host applications on the desktop and then even deliver them as applications, sort of our XD7 functionality here. I include this here because it is something that's possible with Xendesktop 7, and in fact was possible even with some of the classic tools like Xenapp, and even RDS remote apps these days include this supportability. But I bring this to you here because I don't want you necessarily even really to focus on any of what these names are. I want you to kind of focus away on the technologies, but instead on the possible use cases with which you can supply access to an application to a user. Here's one, here's two, here's 3, and here's 4. One of the common fallacies that people have when implementing an application delivery system is in implementing that system for all applications and all users. I hear it all the time, walking around a conference hall or dealing with a consulting client. Look, Greg, we're interested in implementing VDI. Now, when you dig further, you recognize that perhaps this organization isn't implemented in VDI per se. They're implemented in doing a better job of delivering their applications. Well, what Xendesktop 7 is designed to do is to support all of these major use cases at the same time. And so instead of having to make one decision for every application and for every user, what the FlexCast management architecture is designed to do is to support every possible use case for every possible user in every possible application and circumstance. You can, with the collection of machine catalogs and delivery groups, create applications that are hosted on a server but delivered as a desktop, hosted on a server delivered as an application, or hosted on a desktop and delivered as either a desktop or an application. Now, I will freely admit that this is probably confusing you as much as it's probably illuminating what Xendesktop 7 is designed to do. But this is important to recognize because as we begin to consolidate all of these different components together, the end state here is your ability to deliver out an application to a user via any of these possible approaches. Let's talk for a minute now about the architecture. At the center of Xendesktop is what we think of as the delivery controller, or just the controller, or the DC, if you want to call it that. That delivery controller is, as I said before, the kind of the central command center for everything that relates to Xendesktop 7. Your users are going to connect to it. It is going to provide the instructions for your down-level assets to connect up users to desktops or applications. In fact, the delivery controller, in the most simplest of implementations, connects up to your hypervisor. And the Citrix Xenapp actually supports all of the major hypervisors these days. It supports Microsoft Hyper-V, VMware vSphere, and the Citrix XenServer hypervisor. The delivery controller and hypervisor work together through a service called MCS, or Machine Creation Services. Machine Creation Services, as I'll talk about in an upcoming nugget, is kind of the Rosetta Stone. It is the universal translator between the language that Xendesktop speaks and the language that your hypervisor speaks. That MCS allows a delivery controller to say, hey, I need to create a new virtual machine. Well, then the hypervisor can then go to its data store down here and spin up that virtual machine based off of the characteristics that the DC has told it. Now, this connection between the delivery controller and your hypervisor is only one of the ways in which you can create this Citrix infrastructure. Another is through provisioning services. Provisioning services is arguably a more complex setup. It offers some pretty interesting benefits over what you would get with MCS, in that the idea behind provisioning services is that your assets are provisioned at the moment they're booted. Right, so using provisioning services, I can connect up PVS through, for example, a Pixie service and through DHCP to enable any machine or any configured machine to receive an operating system at the moment it boots up. The whole point here is really to create a diskless infrastructure. My disks will still probably end up existing over here on my SAN somewhere, probably the same SAN that your hypervisor is connected up to or something similar. But the notion is that instead of having to create the virtual machines ahead of time, I can create them in a way that allows me to connect to them at the moment they're needed and the moment they're booted. That can happen to the hypervisor, or that can happen to individual devices, so physical devices. If I have the need to manage these physical devices in the same way that I manage my hypervisor, my virtualized devices, well, provisioning services allows me to handle both through one unique delivery infrastructure. Now, in order to have all this, obviously I have to have a licensing server. That server, very lightweight server, probably the only one that doesn't have to be highly available. That server can exist out in the environment in order for all these components to acquire their licenses. When users end up connecting up into this infrastructure, the users are going to connect up into the infrastructure through what is called a storefront server. The storefront server, I keep calling it the front door. The storefront server is a web-based service. It's also a website that users can connect to and identify which resources have been associated with their user account or with whatever groups they're in. So storefront then talks to the delivery controller after a user logs in to say, hey, what kinds of assets does this user or should this user be working with? What published applications? Which desktops should they have access to? Do they have access to their own desktop in the case of remote PC? Now, all of these pieces here are intended to exist kind of on your LAN. When we're talking about the internal LAN, we're talking about the data center, all these are sitting inside the data center so that you can access them from that single location. You yourself will have your own workstation. Your workstation, your management workstation, will have an install of what is called Citrix Studio. Citrix Studio is the administrator's console, the console that you as the admin will be using to create resources, to manipulate resources, and to manage them. Citrix Studio, as well as the provisioning services console, are designed for high-level admins who are doing the big work, the brunt of the work here within Citrix. Citrix also provides, however, a much more lightweight web-based access through what is called Director. Director is designed for those that are perhaps not your high-level Citrix admins. You got to figure, every Citrix admin is supported by a fleet of help desk professionals and technicians. Those help desk professionals and technicians perhaps don't need the level of access that one would get through a full studio console, but they can help that admin out by having a lightweight access. This lightweight access gives them the ability to identify when users are having problems, troubleshoot some of those problems, reset connections, log users out, shadow them when they're having issues, any of the classic things that you would associate with a tier 1 help desk or field technician when they're dealing with the daily flow of tickets and work orders that are coming in. As I said, Citrix Director is a web-based service, and so when the help desk person ends up logging in, they need to do nothing more than punch in the username or name of the person that is contacting them for support to get automatic access to the resources that they require. Now, this entire infrastructure here is designed to support, at this point, everything inside your organization. But one of the great benefits of Citrix is also extending that application access out into untrusted networks like the internet. And in fact, there are other solutions that can accomplish this. If I can create kind of a mini firewall here, the solution that we'll talk about, at least in this series, is the NetScaler. The NetScaler is Citrix's solution that sits in the perimeter, that can proxy the traffic from outside to in. It can accomplish a variety of other tactics like acceleration and authentication and encryption. It's an extremely robust solution for accomplishing all the kinds of things you would normally associate that would sit at that perimeter. For our purposes, we can think of NetScaler as the mechanism that connects up your users on the other side of the internet with your Xendesktop 7 infrastructure. And in a nugget coming up almost at the very end of the series, we'll talk a lot actually, about how to configure the NetScaler to support that functionality. So these really are kind of just the different pieces that we have to lay into place. We will begin with the delivery controller. We will connect it up to our hypervisor. We will then incorporate a storefront server to connect up users via their receiver client. Almost forgot about the receiver client. That receiver client will work with Storefront to enumerate those resources and gather them off of whatever virtual machines we may have them installed onto, be they desktop or server virtual machines. We'll later incorporate provisioning services as well to support our physical devices as well as our virtual devices. And throughout the entire period, everything will connect up to our licensing server and be managed through Citrix Studio and Citrix Director. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have sort of kicked things off for understanding that whole Xendesktop 7 architecture and the components that make up that architecture. We talked about how there really are kind of 4 primary use cases. And we looked at that really interesting chart there that really helped us understand where we would incorporate each of the use cases. You got to look at each application and use case individually to figure out which ones make sense for the user, the application, and the circumstance. We spent just a minute talking about remote PC access, kind of the 5th use case there, and punted a little bit to a future nugget where we'll talk about it in greater detail. And then we went through positioning the different components of Xendesktop 7, the delivery controller in the center, the front door in Storefront, provisioning services for getting those devices and virtual machines provisioned, the NetScaler for protecting things out on untrusted networks, and then our management tools, Studio Director, and also our license server. Coming up next, we begin the process of actually clicking through the buttons to get all this infrastructure in place. We've got a nugget on installing and preparing the Xendesktop core components, which corresponds mainly with that delivery controller, and familiarizing ourselves with its initial configuration. But that's a topic for our next nugget, so until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.